I watched from my cabin window as the police cars pulled up with flashing lights. Karen stood in my driveway, pointing at me like I was some kind of criminal. Her voice carried across the water as she screamed at the officers. "He is trespassing on HOA property. I demand you arrest him immediately." The officer looked confused as he glanced between Karen and my lakeside cabin. I could see him trying to understand why this middle-aged woman was having a complete meltdown over someone sitting peacefully on their own porch. I took a slow sip of my morning coffee and smiled. Karen had no idea what she had just done. She thought she was calling the police on some random troublemaker who dared to defy her authority. But what Karen did not know was this: I did not just own this cabin, I owned the entire county. 3 years ago, I was drowning in the concrete jungle of corporate America. 60-hour work weeks, endless meetings, and the constant pressure of climbing the ladder had left me exhausted and empty. I had built a successful business empire, but somewhere along the way, I had lost myself. That is when I saw the listing. It was buried deep in the back pages of an obscure real estate website. A lakeside cabin in the mountains, surrounded by pristine wilderness and crystal-clear water. The photos showed towering pine trees reflecting in the mirror-like surface of the lake. It looked like something from a dream. The price seemed too good to be true. For what most people paid for a city apartment, I could own a piece of paradise. I called the listing agent immediately, expecting to hear that it was already sold or that there was some major problem with the property. Instead, the transaction went smoother than any real estate deal I had ever experienced. The seller seemed eager to close quickly. The paperwork was straightforward. Within 2 weeks, I held the deed to my own slice of heaven. The first time I stood on that wooden dock, breathing in the clean mountain air, I felt something I had not experienced in years: peace. The silence was broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant call of a loon across the lake. My cabin was simple but perfect. Rustic wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the lake like a living painting. I could sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and watch the sunrise paint the water gold and orange. At night, the stars reflected so clearly in the lake that it felt like floating in space. This was where I planned to spend my retirement. I had worked hard for decades, building businesses and accumulating wealth. Now I wanted something money could not buy: solitude, tranquility, a place where I could finally breathe. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away through thick forest. I could go days without seeing another human being, and that suited me perfectly. I had dealt with enough people in my corporate life to last several lifetimes. I spent my first few months learning the rhythms of the lake. The way morning mist rose from the water like ghosts. How the wind direction changed the color of the surface from blue to green to silver. Which spots were best for fishing, though I mostly just enjoyed the meditation of casting a line. The local wildlife seemed to accept me as part of the landscape. Deer would drink at the water's edge while I sat motionless on my porch. A family of otters played in the shallows near my dock. Eagles nested in the tall pines, and I could watch them soar overhead while I worked in my garden. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. I had found my sanctuary, my refuge from the chaos of modern life. Little did I know that chaos was about to find me. I was enjoying my morning coffee on the porch when I first saw her. A white SUV came roaring down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust that disturbed the perfect stillness of the morning. The vehicle screeched to a halt in front of my cabin, and out stepped the most intimidating woman I had ever encountered. She was tall and sharp-featured, with perfectly styled blonde hair that did not move despite the mountain breeze. Her outfit screamed expensive suburban authority. A crisp white blazer, tailored pants, and shoes that had no business being worn on a dirt road. But it was her expression that truly caught my attention. Pure, undiluted rage. She marched up to my porch like a general preparing for battle. Her heels clicked against the wooden steps with military precision. When she reached the top, she planted herself directly in front of me and crossed her arms. "Excuse me. I am Patricia Williams, president of the Pine Lake Homeowners Association. I need to see your permits immediately." I looked up from my coffee, genuinely confused. Permits for what? Her eyes narrowed. "Do not play games with me. You cannot just build structures and live here without proper HOA approval. Where are your architectural review permits? Your landscaping compliance certificates? Your residential occupancy authorization?" I blinked. "I am sorry, but I think there has been some mistake. This is my property. I own this cabin and the land it sits on." Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was the sound a snake might make if it could express contempt. "Your property. This entire area is governed by the Pine Lake HOA. Every single structure, every tree, every blade of grass must comply with our community standards." She pulled out a thick folder from her designer handbag and began flipping through pages. "Let me educate you about how things work around here. Section 4.2 of our covenants clearly states that all exterior modifications require written approval. Section 6.1 mandates specific paint colors for all structures. Section 12.3 requires monthly inspections of all landscaping." I set down my coffee cup and stood up slowly. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I bought this property fair and square. I have the deed, the title, and all the legal documentation. I do not need anyone's permission to live on my own land." The change in Patricia's expression was immediate and terrifying. Her face flushed red, and her voice rose to a shrill pitch that sent nearby birds fleeing from the trees. "How dare you speak to me like that? Do you know who I am? I have been the president of this HOA for 8 years. I have removed more troublemakers than you can imagine. One phone call from me can make your life absolutely miserable." She began packing back and forth on my porch like a caged animal. "You think you can just show up here and ignore our rules? You think you can disrespect the authority of this community? Well, let me tell you something, mister. I have dealt with rebels like you before, and they all learn the same lesson eventually." I remained calm, which seemed to infuriate her even more. "I am not trying to cause any trouble. I just want to live peacefully on my own property." "Your property," she practically screamed the words. "This is HOA territory, every inch of it, and as long as I am president, you will follow our rules or face the consequences." She pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of my cabin, my dock, my garden, and even me. Unauthorized structures, unapproved landscaping, non-compliant paint colors. This is just the beginning. Patricia stormed back to her SUV, but turned around for one final threat. "You have 48 hours to submit all required paperwork and bring your property into compliance. If you do not, you will discover exactly what happens to people who cross the Pine Lake HOA." She slammed her car door and peeled out, leaving a cloud of dust and the echo of her threats hanging in the air. I sat back down and picked up my coffee cup, but my hands were shaking slightly. I had dealt with difficult people in business for decades, but something about Patricia Williams felt different. This was not just professional disagreement. This was personal. She had declared war on me, and I had the sinking feeling that my peaceful retirement was about to become very complicated. The harassment began the very next day. I woke up to find a certified letter taped to my front door. Inside was an official-looking document with the Pine Lake HOA letterhead, listing 17 separate violations of community standards. According to Patricia, my mailbox was 3 inches too tall. My grass exceeded the maximum permitted length by half an inch. The color of my cabin was not on the approved paint palette. My dock extended 2 feet beyond the allowable waterfront projection. The list went on, each violation more ridiculous than the last. I crumpled up the letter and threw it in the trash. If Patricia wanted to play games, I was not going to participate. I had better things to do than argue about mailbox heights and grass measurements. But Patricia was just getting started. Over the next 2 weeks, the citations came daily, sometimes twice a day. Each letter was more threatening than the last, demanding immediate compliance and threatening legal action. She cited me for having unauthorized flower planters on my porch, for parking my truck in my own driveway without proper permits, for having a bird feeder that was not approved by the Architectural Review Committee. She even wrote me up for the color of my welcome mat. The absurdity reached new heights when she cited me for my firewood pile. Apparently, stacking wood more than 4 feet high violated the community's aesthetic standards. When I ignored that citation, she followed up with another one claiming that the type of wood I was burning was not on the approved fuel list. I watched from my window as Patricia drove by my cabin multiple times each day, always slowing down to take pictures and notes. She recruited other HOA board members to join her surveillance missions. Soon, I had a parade of suburban busybodies documenting every aspect of my daily life. The psychological pressure was intense. I could not step outside without wondering what new violation they would invent. I could not enjoy my morning coffee without seeing Patricia's white SUV creeping past like a shark circling its prey. But I refused to give in. Every citation went into the trash. Every demand for compliance was ignored. Every threat was met with silence. I had spent too many years bowing to unreasonable authority figures in the corporate world. I was not about to start taking orders from some power-hungry HOA president. My defiance seemed to drive Patricia into a frenzy. The citations became more frequent and more desperate. She started showing up at my door unannounced, demanding to inspect my property for new violations. When I refused to let her inside, she would walk around the perimeter of my cabin, taking measurements and photos like a detective at a crime scene. The other neighbors began to notice the drama. Some approached me quietly to express their support. They shared stories of Patricia's reign of terror, how she had forced families to paint their houses 3 times to get the exact shade of beige she approved, how she had made elderly residents tear out flower gardens that brought them joy, how she had driven good people away from the community with her relentless harassment. But none of them were willing to stand up to her publicly. Fear ruled this neighborhood. Patricia had created a climate of intimidation where everyone lived in constant worry about the next citation, the next fine, the next threat. I was different, though. I had nothing to lose and no intention of being bullied. Each day that I ignored her demands seemed to make Patricia more unhinged. Her letters became more personal, more vicious. She started questioning my character, my background, my right to exist in her perfect little kingdom. The breaking point came when Patricia issued a citation for my American flag. According to her, the flagpole was not regulation height, and the flag itself was too large for the approved display standards. She demanded that I either remove it entirely or replace it with a smaller flag on a shorter pole. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done playing defense. If Patricia wanted a war, she was about to get one. But first, I needed her to make the mistake that would seal her fate. I did not have to wait long. The next morning, I saw Patricia's car turn into my driveway, followed by two police cruisers. She had finally played her nuclear card. Little did she know, she had just walked into the trap I had been waiting for her to spring. The sound of sirens shattered the morning calm. I watched from my kitchen window as two police cruisers pulled up behind Patricia's SUV, their red and blue lights flashing against the trees. My heart was pounding, but not from fear, from anticipation. Patricia jumped out of her car like she was storming a battlefield. She was wearing what I had come to think of as her battle uniform. The crisp white blazer, the power heels, and an expression of righteous fury that could have melted steel. Officer Martinez was the first to approach. He was a middle-aged Hispanic man with the patient demeanor of someone who had dealt with his share of neighborhood disputes. His partner, Officer Chen, looked younger and less experienced, but equally professional. "Ma'am, you called about a trespassing situation," Officer Martinez asked. Patricia immediately launched into a performance that would have impressed Broadway audiences. She gestured wildly at my cabin, her voice rising with each accusation. "Officers, this man has been illegally occupying HOA property for months. He has built unauthorized structures. He has violated dozens of community standards. He has threatened me personally when I tried to enforce our rules." I stepped out onto my porch, coffee cup in hand, and waved politely at the officers. My calm demeanor seemed to infuriate Patricia even more. "There he is," she shrieked, pointing at me like I was a wanted fugitive. "Arrest him immediately for criminal trespassing and destruction of community property." Officer Martinez looked confused. "Ma'am, can you slow down and explain the situation? This gentleman appears to be on his own property." "His property?" Patricia's voice cracked with hysteria. "This entire area belongs to the Pine Lake Homeowners Association. He has no right to be here, no right at all." I walked down from my porch, still carrying my coffee, and approached the officers with a friendly smile. "Good morning, officers. I am sorry you had to come out here for what appears to be a misunderstanding." Patricia immediately inserted herself between me and the police. "Do not let him manipulate you. This man is a criminal. He has been harassing our community for weeks. He threatens violence against anyone who tries to enforce our rules." Officer Chen finally spoke up. "Sir, do you have documentation showing you own this property?" "Of course," I replied calmly. "Would you like to see my deed and title documents?" "That is fake," Patricia screamed before I could even retrieve the papers. "He probably printed them at home. Officers, you need to arrest him right now before he becomes violent." The officers exchanged glances. I could see them beginning to question who the real problem was in this situation. Officer Martinez turned to Patricia with a slightly sterner tone. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down and let us handle this. Can you show us any documentation that proves this property belongs to your HOA?" Patricia fumbled through her designer bag, pulling out the same folder she had shown me weeks earlier. "Here are our community covenants. Section 1.1 clearly states that all property within the Pine Lake development is subject to HOA governance." Officer Martinez flipped through a few pages, then looked up with growing skepticism. "Ma'am, these are HOA rules and regulations. They do not prove ownership of this specific property. Do you have a deed or title document?" "I do not need a deed," Patricia snapped. "I am the HOA president. My authority is absolute within this community." Meanwhile, I had retrieved my property documents from inside the cabin. I handed them to Officer Chen, who examined them carefully. His eyebrows rose as he read through the legal description and boundary details. "These appear to be legitimate ownership documents," he said to his partner. Patricia snatched the papers from his hands before Officer Martinez could examine them. "These are forgeries. This man is a con artist. He probably stole someone's identity to create fake documents." Officer Martinez was clearly losing patience. "Ma'am, I need you to return those documents to the officer immediately. Your behavior is becoming disruptive." Disruptive. Patricia's voice reached a pitch that made nearby dogs start barking. "I am trying to protect this community from a dangerous criminal, and you are calling me disruptive." She began packing in circles, waving the documents above her head like battle flags. "This is exactly what is wrong with law enforcement today. You refuse to support law-abiding citizens. You let criminals run wild while harassing innocent HOA presidents." The officers had clearly seen enough. Officer Chen retrieved the property documents while Officer Martinez stepped closer to Patricia. "Ma'am, based on the documentation we have seen, this gentleman appears to be the legal owner of this property. Unless you have evidence of actual criminal activity, we cannot take any enforcement action." Patricia's face turned purple. "You are both incompetent. I am calling your supervisor. I am calling the sheriff. I am calling the mayor. You will both be fired for this." As she continued her tirade, the officers approached me with apologetic expressions. "Sorry about this, sir. We have to respond to all 911 calls, even when they turn out to be civil disputes." I smiled and shook both their hands. "No problem at all, officers. I understand you are just doing your job." As the police cars pulled away, Patricia stood in my driveway, shaking with rage. She had played her ultimate card and lost, but I could see in her eyes that she was not finished. If anything, this defeat had only made her more dangerous. Patricia's humiliation in front of the police should have been the end of our conflict. Any reasonable person would have accepted defeat and moved on. But Patricia was not reasonable. She was obsessed. The harassment intensified after her failed police gambit. She started showing up at my property multiple times per day, always with her phone camera ready to document new violations. She brought measuring tapes to check my grass height. She used surveying equipment to verify my property boundaries. She even brought a paint color chart to compare my cabin's exterior to the approved HOA palette. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. I would catch her walking through my woods at dawn, looking for unauthorized structures or environmental violations. She started questioning my neighbors about my activities, trying to build a case that I was somehow damaging the community. The final straw came when Patricia organized what she called a compliance inspection. She showed up with 3 other HOA board members, all carrying clipboards and cameras, demanding access to my entire property for a comprehensive review. That is when I decided it was time to show Patricia exactly who she was dealing with. I invited her and her inspection team to sit on my porch for what I called a little chat about property rights. Patricia's eyes gleamed with triumph. She thought I was finally ready to surrender to her authority. "I am glad you have finally come to your senses," she said, settling into one of my porch chairs like a queen claiming her throne. "Once we complete our inspection and you bring everything into compliance, we can put this unfortunate misunderstanding behind us." I smiled and pulled out a folder from inside my cabin. It was thick with legal documents, survey maps, and property records. Patricia glanced at it dismissively. If those are more fake ownership papers, you can save your breath. I have already reported your fraudulent documents to the authorities. I opened the folder slowly, letting the suspense build. The first document was my original property deed. But unlike the simple residential deed Patricia had seen before, this one contained detailed legal descriptions that went on for several pages. Patricia, I think you should take a closer look at this deed, particularly the section that describes the exact boundaries of my property. She snatched the document and began reading. At first, her expression remained smug and dismissive, but as she read further, I watched her face change. Confusion replaced confidence. Her eyes widened as she traced the property description with her finger. "This cannot be right," she muttered. "This says your property extends, but that would mean—" I pulled out a surveyor's map and spread it across the porch table. The boundaries of my property were highlighted in bright red. Patricia stared at the map like she was looking at a foreign language. "According to the county records, Patricia, my property includes not just this cabin and the immediate lakefront, but also the access road you drive on to get here, and the parking area where you hold your HOA meetings, and the common areas where your neighbors' children play." The color drained from Patricia's face. "That is impossible. The HOA owns all the common areas. We have owned them for 20 years. I shook my head gently. "Actually, you have been using them under an informal agreement with the previous owner. But when he sold to me, all those usage rights transferred to my control." Patricia jumped up from her chair, the surveyor's map falling to the floor. "You are lying. This is another one of your tricks. No one person could own that much property in this area." I pulled out another document. This one was stamped with the official seal of the county assessor's office. "Property tax records do not lie, Patricia. Would you like to see exactly how much property tax I pay each year on my holdings in this county?" She grabbed the tax document and stared at the numbers. Her hands began to tremble. "This amount. This is more than our entire HOA budget, but this would mean you own—" "More than you realize," I said quietly. "Much more than you realize." Patricia's 3 board members had remained silent throughout this exchange, but I could see the panic growing in their eyes. They were beginning to understand that their president had picked a fight with someone far beyond their ability to intimidate. "You still have to follow HOA rules," Patricia said desperately. "Property ownership does not exempt you from community standards." I stood up and walked to the edge of my porch, looking out over the lake that reflected the afternoon sun like liquid gold. "Patricia, you have spent months trying to force me to follow your rules, but you never stopped to ask a very important question." She stared at me with growing dread. "What question?" I turned back to face her, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I let her see the full extent of my confidence. "The question is this: what happens when the person you are trying to bully owns the ground you are standing on?" Patricia stared at me in stunned silence as the full weight of my words sank in. I could see her mind racing, trying to process the implications of what she had just learned. But she had no idea how deep this rabbit hole actually went. I walked back to my folder and pulled out a much thicker stack of documents. "Since you seem so interested in property ownership, Patricia, let me show you the complete picture of what I actually own in this county." The first document was a master deed for what the county called the Pine Lake Development Tract. Patricia's eyes widened as she read the legal description. It covered not just my lakefront property, but the entire development where all the HOA homes were built. "This covers the whole neighborhood," she whispered. "That is correct. Every house in your HOA development sits on land that I own. Your neighbors do not own their lots. They own their structures, but the actual ground belongs to me." Patricia's face had gone completely white. But we have been collecting HOA fees for maintenance of common areas. We have been making decisions about community standards. How could you own all of this?" I pulled out another document. This one showed the ownership transfer that had occurred when the original developer went bankrupt 15 years ago. The previous developer sold everything to my investment company when the housing market crashed. Most of the residents never knew about the ownership change because it did not affect their mortgages or home ownership rights. One of Patricia's board members, a thin man named Robert, finally found his voice. "If you own all the land, why did you let the HOA continue operating?" Simple. The HOA was doing a good job maintaining the common areas and keeping property values stable. I had no reason to interfere as long as everyone was happy and the community was well managed. Patricia was shaking now, the documents clutched in her trembling hands. "But you could have stopped me. You could have ended this whole conflict months ago just by telling me who you are." I nodded slowly. "I could have, but I wanted to see how far you would take your harassment campaign. I wanted to understand exactly what kind of person I was dealing with." I pulled out yet another document, this one showing a corporate structure chart. Patricia's eyes followed the ownership lines from subsidiary companies up to parent corporations, all ultimately controlled by my investment firm. "My business interests in this county go far beyond residential real estate, Patricia. I own the shopping center where most of your neighbors work, the grocery store where they buy their food, the gas stations where they fill their cars, even the bank where many of them have their mortgages." Patricia sank back into her chair, the fight finally going out of her. "You own everything." "Not everything, but enough to make your life very complicated if you continue this harassment campaign." Robert spoke up again, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you going to do to us?" I sat back down and folded my hands calmly. "That depends entirely on Patricia's next decision. She can choose to end this conflict gracefully, or she can continue fighting someone who holds all the cards." Patricia looked up at me with a mixture of terror and desperate defiance. "You cannot just kick people out of their homes. There are laws, there are contracts." "You are absolutely right. I cannot simply evict homeowners who are current on their payments and following reasonable community standards. But I can dissolve the HOA entirely, since it exists only at my discretion as the actual landowner." The implications hit Patricia like a physical blow. Without the HOA, there would be no community standards, no architectural review, no maintenance of common areas. Correct, and more importantly for you, Patricia, there would be no need for an HOA president. I pulled out one final document. This one was a legal notice that I had prepared months ago but never filed. This notice would dissolve the Pine Lake HOA effective immediately and transfer all common area maintenance responsibilities directly to my property management company. Patricia read the document with growing horror. "You would destroy the entire community just to get revenge on me." "I would not be destroying anything, Patricia. I would be removing a layer of bureaucracy that has become corrupt and abusive. The residents would still own their homes. The common areas would still be maintained. The only thing that would change is that there would be no more HOA board to harass innocent people." The silence stretched out as Patricia realized she had painted herself into a corner with no escape. She had picked a fight with someone who could end her reign of terror with a single phone call to the county clerk's office. Finally, Robert cleared his throat. "Patricia, maybe we should reconsider our approach here. Maybe we have been too aggressive in our enforcement policies." Patricia whirled on him with fury. "Do not you dare turn on me now, Robert. I have protected this community for 8 years. I have maintained our property values. I have kept out the riffraff." I stood up slowly, my patience finally exhausted. "Patricia, you have exactly 24 hours to make a decision. You can resign from the HOA board, issue a public apology for your harassment campaign, and promise to leave me alone permanently. Or I can file this dissolution notice and end your little kingdom forever." Patricia stared at me with pure hatred, but for the first time since I had met her, she had nothing to say. The Queen had finally met someone with more power than she possessed, and the realization was breaking her spirit before my eyes. Patricia did not resign. I had not expected her to. People like Patricia do not surrender gracefully. They fight until the bitter end, even when fighting only makes their defeat more complete. Instead of stepping down, she spent the next 24 hours trying to rally support from other HOA board members and community residents. She called emergency meetings. She sent desperate emails. She even tried to contact local news outlets, claiming that a mysterious billionaire was trying to destroy their peaceful neighborhood. But Patricia had made one crucial miscalculation. The residents of Pine Lake were not her loyal subjects. They were people who had been living under her tyranny for years, and many of them welcomed the chance to finally be free of her control. When the 24-hour deadline passed with no resignation, I made good on my promise. I drove to the county courthouse and filed the HOA dissolution paperwork. Within hours, the Pine Lake Homeowners Association ceased to exist as a legal entity. The immediate consequences were swift and devastating for Patricia. The dissolution meant that all HOA contracts were void, including her consulting agreement that paid her a generous annual salary for her services as president. Her access to the community clubhouse was revoked. Her authority to issue citations and collect fees evaporated overnight. But the personal consequences went much deeper. As word spread about Patricia's harassment campaign against the county's largest landowner, her reputation in the community crumbled. The local businesses where she had tried to wield her HOA authority suddenly wanted nothing to do with her. The social circles that had once feared her influence now treated her as a pariah. Within a week, Patricia's husband filed for divorce. According to neighbors, he had grown tired of being married to someone who spent all her time fighting with people over trivial rule violations. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but everyone knew the real reason. He was embarrassed by his wife's public humiliation and wanted to distance himself from the scandal. The financial impact was equally severe. Patricia had invested heavily in local real estate, assuming that her HOA influence would help maintain property values in the area. But when potential buyers learned about the dissolved HOA and the drama surrounding it, several deals fell through. Patricia lost tens of thousands of dollars on properties she had to sell at reduced prices. The social isolation was perhaps the worst punishment of all. Patricia had built her entire identity around being the neighborhood authority figure. Without the HOA presidency, she was just another resident with no special power or influence. The people who had once feared her now avoided her entirely. The respect she thought she commanded had been revealed as nothing more than intimidation. Meanwhile, the Pine Lake community began to flourish without Patricia's oppressive rule. My property management company took over maintenance of the common areas and did a better job than the HOA had ever done. Residents were free to plant gardens, paint their homes in colors they actually liked, and make improvements without jumping through bureaucratic hoops. The neighbor who had been forced to tear out her rose garden was able to replant it. The elderly man who had been cited for his American flag display was able to fly it with pride. Children could play in the common areas without worrying about violating noise ordinances or grass preservation rules. Property values actually increased after the HOA dissolution. Without the threat of arbitrary rule enforcement and constant citations, Pine Lake became a desirable place to live again. New families moved in, drawn by the beautiful location and the promise of reasonable community management. As for me, I returned to my peaceful lakeside retirement. The harassment campaign that had consumed months of my time was finally over. I could once again enjoy my morning coffee without watching for Patricia's white SUV creeping past my cabin. I could work in my garden without wondering what new violation she would invent. The irony was not lost on me. Patricia had spent so much energy trying to force me to follow her rules that she never stopped to consider who she was actually fighting. She had assumed that anyone who chose to live quietly by a lake must be powerless against her authority. She had been spectacularly wrong. Sometimes, in the evening, I would sit on my porch and watch the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and orange. The silence was broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant call of loons across the water. It was exactly the peaceful retirement I had dreamed of when I first bought this property. Justice had been served, not through revenge or cruelty, but through the simple application of legal authority that Patricia never knew existed. She had declared war on someone who owned the battlefield, and the outcome had been inevitable from the moment she made that first threat on my porch. The lesson was clear. Before you try to bully someone, you should probably find out who they really are. Patricia learned that lesson the hard way, and it cost her everything she thought she had built.